notes for those of you who are looking at the clocks and thinking, oh, we're in a different time zone. I think every clock in this hall is wrong, just to confuse students. Also, we've got some people who need some seats, so if there are seats in the middle, if we could just shuffle along. We've got some spare seats just down here. I think, is everyone in? Mel, that's great. All right, we're going to crack into it. Ladies and gentlemen, what a great session we have to begin us this morning. Three speakers sharing the story of the Central Otago. So I'm going to begin by introducing the first of them. His session is on gold mining, the origins of Otago's water races. Terry Davis is the Secretary for the Otago Goldfields Heritage Trust. His main role is organising the annual cavalcade, which is absolutely excellent, and it's based on a reenactment of the gold rush era from the 1860s, if you aren't familiar with it. He also organises field trips for members and friends, which includes a water race or two and typically some sort of dam. So to set the scene for the morning, please welcome Terry Davis.
Thanks very much for that, Terry. Oh, good. I don't need to go on too much about myself. I will just let you know that I was born in Herlihy, just down the road, and I grew up most of my life in Cromwell on a merino sheep farm. So we had 100 acres and 1,000 acres, and about 1/3 of that was irrigation. So in a lot of countries or a lot of places around the world, farmers have to deal with a bit of irrigation. Central Otago, there's a lot of irrigators have to deal with a bit of farming here and there. So 1,000 acres was just enough. We ran about 3,000 stock units, and we could only do that because 1/3 of the farm was set out in border dikes. So we had a whole lot of flood irrigation, shifting gates and that sort of thing. Let's see if I can make this work. Green for forward, red for back. Maybe that was off. Oh, there's a big green one. That one, there we go. All right, so Terry has already mentioned I work for the Otago Goldfields Heritage Trust. Back in the mid-80s, it was decided we really should set up a system of acknowledging and looking after some of these wonderful sites of previous goldfields activity. It's quite funny that this is what we... Today, we take members on walking groups and tours and have a look at old dams and water races up in the hill. We love it. And some of the newly formed landmark locations for tourism, most fantastic areas to go and visit in Central Otago are goldfield sites, like the Stewarttown sluicings. Now, it's funny, we're all talking about the impact of water and irrigation and cleanliness of the water and things. If anybody was here back in the 1860s, you wouldn't have been able to see anything in the river, just running absolute brown. I don't know how there's any fish left in the rivers today. Back then there was cyanide and all sorts of terrible stuff. So it is on one hand, it's quite funny that we're really promoting an era of absolute environmental debauchery. But it's all good fun. And here's the other things the Otago Goldfields Heritage Trust do is a bit of restoration. So we pull out the odd dredge pontoon from the river, and we go for walks. And I tell you, when you're going for a walk, water races are fantastic. Water races, old water races, they're just a good gradient. They're used a lot for hiking now, and cycleways. Here's an idea. Even it doesn't have to be an old water race. If you're putting in new water races, you've always got good access alongside for cleaning and maintenance. They make fantastic cycleways. Cycleways is all the rage. If you're putting in a new irrigation scheme and you can incorporate a bit of cycling, all of a sudden you've got a heap of townies on board because they want to be able to go riding their bicycle. Just thinking out loud. And trail running. So there's one of the biggest mountain marathons in New Zealand is the Moonlight Shot Over Marathon out the back of Queenstown, and a ton of that course is running over old water races. So that's just another aspect of the water races built by the gold miners being used and bringing in tourist dollars, and they're just fantastic. It's interesting. I think there's a lot of similarities, or there's a relationship between ultra runners, people who do stupid things and run ridiculous distances and drive their bodies into the ground. Our lives these days, for a lot of those sort of folks, are so mundane and vanilla. and they're getting back to what it must have been like just every day for the gold miners, having to get up and slog for hours and hours and hours. So we've worked really, really hard to get ourselves to a point where we've actually made our lives worse somehow. Anyway, I just chucked this in because it's a really nice photo, nothing to do with irrigation, but the Goldfields Heritage Trust does organise the cavalcade, and those are some beautiful cavalcade pictures. And once again, horse riders, when they're up in the mountains, they'll often find themselves following old water races as well. Right, just a little comment. 19th century discovery of gold was a way out of poverty. From the 1860s, gold rush followed gold rush, and thousands flocked to the fields. But the work was harsh, with days spent digging in cold creek beds. Only a lucky few found riches in the rock. However, the collective value of the gold that was discovered kick-started the young colony's economy. Gold was the making of early New Zealand. So I'm not saying that these water races wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the gold. You know, water races certainly would have happened, but gold was the kick-starter. Before the gold rushes in Central Otago, there were run holders, you know, there were stations and farms. They may have had some small water races here and there, but the mass production of really significant water races that transferred water over, you know, tens up to hundreds of kilometres really was all about the gold. So the Mount Ida water race, which runs along from the Hawkton and Ida ranges, took 4 years to build, and it employed 1 man per 22 kilometres after it was built, full time looking after the race. Another example there, J.R. Ewing, he constructed a race near Roxburgh. So they used to dig tunnels through sheer rock. They used kilometres of iron pipe. Sometimes it was a full pipe, sometimes it was only half a pipe to get around rocky cliffs and things. The use of siphons. There was a heap of siphons, and siphons are something quite amazing. If anyone's heading down to Dunedin from here, driving past Roxburgh, there's a fantastic example of a big siphon right there. And Carrick Water Race is another good one out the back of Cromwell, and I'll show you some examples of that. I'll leave an example of the Carrick Water Race. But what I wanted to talk about, you know, initially the first miners that came here in the early 1860s, the first gold rush was in the Lindis Pass. It was about 500 miners went in there. And from there was people kicking around and they were looking for gold bits and pieces. There wasn't a lot of water races dug. The first part was really panning and prospecting. So you just get down in the creek, wherever there's already water flowing, and you have a little bit of a look. And in those early days, they quite literally, you know, scraped with their boot, and they were picking up nuggets off some of the beaches. So that was the good old days. They had a very hard winter in 1862. Very hard winter, and that means the rivers are really low. Because in Central Otago, if there's a lot of, if there's any rain, or if it's very, very cold, all that rain just sits in the mountains as snow. And nothing actually makes it down into the rivers. So 1862, the rivers were unusually low. And what this did was it exposed some beaches and some parts of the river that had never been exposed before. And there was a couple of guys, old Herlihy and Riley, that they had heard rumours of gold in this area, and they just quietly did their thing, didn't tell too many people what they were up to. After 2 months of mucking around, they headed back to Dunedin, and they had about 38 kilograms of gold. So this really kick-started the gold rush. Before then, there had been other rushes, and there was Lawrence was before Herlihy and Riley, but our governor at the time, he had come over from Victoria. Now the gold rushes, just to put it in context, it really started in the Yukon in Canada, and then it moved down to California, and then after California they all went to Victoria in Australia, and Victoria fields, they were all pretty well depleted. Nothing too much was happening. So people were starting to spread out and look for other areas where there might be gold. There was a sniff of gold in Central Otago, but the current governor, he had come from Victoria, and he knew of what it was like being in a gold mining area, and he did not want that for Otago. So at every opportunity, he would quieten it down and say, no, there's not really that much gold, there's nothing to see here. But when old Herlihy and Riley went down there with 40 kgs of gold, kind of the cat was out of the bag, and quite literally Dunedin was emptied of every able-bodied man. School teachers, lawyers, doctors, anyone who could walk and carry a shovel, they made their way over the Dunstan, of the old Dunstan track and into Central Otago. So those guys, they didn't build too many water races. They were just digging right in the rivers themselves, using their pan, getting what they could, using a bit of a sluice box. Not a lot of races built at that stage. But obviously those easy winnings, they were pretty quickly taken away, and people had to start working a bit harder. Now sluicing. Sluicing has left us with some absolutely fantastic landmarks, like the sluicings at Bannockburn. We had sluicings on our farm where I grew up, and we had 3 water races on our place. One of the water race used for sluicing was the main one that filled our irrigation dam, and then above that there was another water race, and above that, only a couple of metres, there was another water race. So that's the crazy thing. When you're out and about in Central Otago, you'll see these lines going around the hills, and then there'll be another line only a few metres above it, and sometimes another one, and you think, shit, it took years to dig that one water race, and then either they realised they didn't have enough head of pressure, or someone else came along and didn't have the rights to that water, so they had to build their own water race, and they just built it just a couple of metres above. Seems terribly inefficient, but they did what they had to do. So, sluicing, highly, highly water intensive, as you might gather. Take water from a high point, bring it down to a lower point. You start with a big pipe, finish with a very small pipe, you get high pressure. You point that at the hillside, and you're literally just washing the hillside away. You might have to wash through several metres of just gravel and rubbish before you get to the gold-bearing soils down low. So a lot of this water was just used to clear the land, clear off all the rubble, and get down to the area where you know the gold is. Then you channel the water and all the sludge over riffle boxes and different devices that allow the heavy gold to sink to the bottom and everything else to wash away. So sluicing was highly intensive on water, and so you needed to create water races, and this is a look at the siphon in Roxburgh, a massive big thing. The other type of gold mining was hard rock mining. So this is where you are digging and blasting and picking into the schist rock, getting into veins of quartz and gold in the solid bedrock, not on the beaches. And to do that, you need power, and they used a lot of water wheels, so you needed water to drive the water wheels. Also, you needed water to transport the rocks and the stuff that you try and get gold out of to the crusher, and then you need water to take away all the slag and all the rubbish. So water was very, very important. This is a picture of the Come in Time stamper battery in the Thompson's Gorge. So I think it's a 10 or a 1, 2, 3, 4, might be 12 stamper battery. And a lot of the problems in Central Otago too, the water was very hit and miss. So you put in these water races, you gather as much water as you can, but during the summer, you'd have a holding dam where you would build up your pressure, get enough water, and then once that was gone, you might have to wait a few days or a week or two, depending on the season and stuff, before you could run your machinery again. So there was, water, very, very important. We worked on a project very closely with the Department of Conservation and rebuilt the old stamper back to its glory. Some of the timber was getting a bit rotten and it was all going to fall down. So I think I'm kind of whizzing through, but the big influence of gold in Central Otago, yes, there was quite a bit of money went out through Dunedin. I've got this picture of the Dunedin railway station. I'm sure most of you have been to Dunedin. Some of the most fantastic old buildings were built of that gold rush era in the 1870s, 1880s. It's funny, I think there was a lot more money came into New Zealand looking for gold. They never actually left New Zealand as gold. We remember back in the days where it took 3 or 4 or 6 months to get a letter from Dunedin back to the UK, and word would go out that there's been a strike and there's riches to be made, and I just need a few £1,000s to invest and I'll be able to triple your money. And literally by the time the boat got to the UK, that gold rush had already run out. And it was over and people were moving on. And then by the time the ship got back with the money or the people and resources, they'd moved on to other things. We did the other type of gold mining that I'm not going to talk too much about because there's very little to do with water races, is dredging. So after they had done as much sluicing and hard rock mining as they could, well, it happened in the same time, but the dredging carried on a lot longer. They had these great dredges in the rivers. Now, in 1902, there was something like 102 dredging companies listed, and I think about 6 of them paid dividends. So the vast majority, people got money, they set up companies, they built dredges, they went and never quite made enough to pay any dividends. So there was a fair bit of that going on. Right, what else? I think that's it for my pictures there. These pictures were there to just prompt me and things to talk. Are we going to have questions later on? Good as gold.
Thank you, Terry. That was a great presentation. Going to go for a bit of a stroll. The second of our presentations is on the first wave of irrigation, the Depression years and soldier settlements with Gary Kelliher. There he is. Gary's a sheep and deer farmer from Springvale near Alexandra. They've been there for 4 generations, so he knows the area pretty well. The farmer's half irrigated and half dry land, and he is a part of that scheme there and an Otago Regional Councillor. Hello, Gary.
Thank you. Yes, former Otago Regional Councillor. We won't go there. Welcome and thank you for listening to me today. Before I start, I do need to warn you that nearly all of what I'm about to say was written during the Commonwealth Games, and I was quite distracted, so if it doesn't make any sense at all, you'll know why. This also was my old high school, so it is actually quite nice to get a chance to be on the stage, even if it is 27 years after I was last here, and those toilets are tiny. I'm discussing the period from when irrigation actually took hold for the purpose of productivity, outside of mining or sustaining miners. This is around the turn of the 1900s and the decades following that. Most of the irrigation schemes in Central Otago were established for the purpose of irrigation, and while some do have their origins from mining, they are mostly actually as you'd establish them for irrigation. The miners had a very similar need. Take water from a source where it has some volume or reliability, travel it along a very long race and utilise every drop. Gravity and least resistance were the 2 critical factors. Excellent, the green button works. As Terry has described the early years, this middle period established Central Otago for what it is today, a productive, healthy, growing district in the heart of an extreme region. 2 world wars, recession and depression years, boom times with wool and fruit, and governments of the time that provided for soldiers and their service by breaking up the substantial holdings. This has been the creation of our rural communities that have evolved to what we see now, but with challenges all the way. The real potential of Central Otago was identified in the late 1800s, when the governments of the time were encouraged and lobbied by communities here into taking a lead role in planning, funding and establishing irrigation schemes, where opportunities were identified for these. This included government acquiring water rights where available from completed or abandoned mining operations, Access to water had been allocated through the wardens' courts located in each town or settlement. From 1917 and through the 1920s and 30s, saw a flurry of schemes constructed by the Public Works Department across Central Otago. 20 schemes covering about 45,000 hectares. The engineer in me has many times admired when standing at the top of an extremely steep gorge or at one of the dams, how in those early years, government engineers and surveyors stood in those spots and planned and envisaged what could be done. I've often thought what it would be like standing there today with today's contractors and explaining the scope of a 1,600 metre long tunnel to be hand excavated predominantly through rock. I think if the budget estimate didn't include the words tunnel boring machine, their interest would be off into the scenery pretty quickly. What does impress me is that as we do new studies today, this work shows that what those experts found and did then is pretty damn close to what we would actually be doing today. The command areas, the dam sites, and how to distribute is all appearing pretty similar. We are so lucky in this arid area of Otago as we have so much water it's not funny. The problem then, and it was and now, is that it's mainly there not at the right time. We have more than we could possibly ever use, and in many locations the luxury of gravity is on our side. Those experts back then, they scoped all of these rivers and catchments, and without the advantage of years of detailed hydrology records, they were able to pick the rivers suited for dams and those that weren't. Rivers such as the Lindis, Cardrona and Arrow all had schemes constructed on them based on run-of-the-river flows. The Tairi, Herlihy and contributing catchments alongside the Kelliher had storage dams constructed either on a stem of the river or in a well-flowing tributary where the topography suited. These dams are all in use today, and they will be for many years yet. Some are not large enough to provide the reliability that their schemes need. Some have the ability to be increased in height, such as Falls Dam, and one tour visited Falls Dam yesterday. They're integral parts of the functionality of each scheme. They're absolutely critical. This work was mainly done through the Depression years, and they were very effective government-run work schemes for much needed employment, but maybe not so pleasant for a worker living in a tent over winter on one of those construction sites. Varying construction methods were chosen: concrete arch, uncompacted rock fill, over the crest spillway, and even an enclosed glory hole type spillway were all used. The quality of the construction and the methodology at the time is a testament to those who built them, as other than a couple of them that have needed some remedial issues sorted, they generally remain as very sound structures. If you look at one near here, Butcher's Dam, it is now a very popular public track and creates a unique experience to cross it as the track runs along the lake it creates. Last week when we were there as a family, there were camper vans, cyclists, walkers, and families there fishing. To me, this is irrigation serving its purpose, but also enhancing a feature for all of the community to use. Once these dams and schemes were constructed, it brought new families and land use, along with mainly sheep and beef being the preferred options. It had already long been recognised as the climate-suited horticulture, and this grew along with small-scale dairying in some areas. My grandfather and his brothers were brought up near Clyde in the Waikirikiri Valley, mining and farming. As very young men, they bought their farms at Springvale in anticipation of the schemes coming, and really started there with nothing right from scratch. One of those brothers decided that watering dry land was not for him, and instead started a wee brewery you may have heard of. Watering people turned out to be a far more lucrative business for that faction of the family. As the schemes and races were being built, the farms within their command areas had to install how they would use the water and lay out their own races to contour manage the flows. Some farms had large tracts of land outside of the command area. For these properties, the irrigation created the ability to guarantee winter feed, and it remains a critical part of the success of those properties. Others were entirely or predominantly within the command areas. Contour flooding and later where topography allowed border diking were the methods available for them to use. Some of these systems were very effective, and water could be used 3 or 4 times within a property. Many were not so effective, and it really comes down to the diligence of each individual farmer. Across all of the schemes though, right from the start, and especially the run-of-the-river ones, reliability in dry seasons became their biggest issue. In dry seasons, rationing and working together quickly become necessary. Where townships and settlements like Queenstown, Cromwell and Alexandra had established servicing the mining sector, the addition of agriculture, followed by horticulture and then the irrigation schemes, grew these towns as agriculture and horticulture service centres. For here in Alexandra, that remains key to its economy and its community. The Kelliher River is often questioned as to why isn't its water used more than the lesser rivers and streams that feed it. Why do you suck out of a poor little river that's high in winter and low in summer, when you've got the Kelliher, which is a substantial source, averaging around 500 cumecs and fed from the very high rainfall of the Southern Alps, and it's a very reliable source. The problem for the original settlers as they arrived here is its scale and just how hard it is to get across it even without bridges first. The problem to utilise water from it for mining and then for irrigation was the size of the river and the sheer volume of the flow. The scale of its seasonal fluctuations made it extremely difficult to access the water with what was available to do this in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Galleries and pumps are common today, but they were very primitive then in a newly developing region. Also unhelpful is that the huge volume of water that has carved its channel since the glaciers receded means it tends to flow in its own channel 30 to 50 metres below the terraces where it's needed. The productive valley floors of the contributing rivers also increase in grade so that it was just more sensible to use their flows from upstream with the benefit of gravity for the races to deliver or distribute the water. As the schemes were built and commissioned, they all had some teething issues, some quite major, and races needed repairs and in some cases new tunnels dug to remove leaks and slips. The schemes were run by the Public Works Department, which became the Ministry of Works, and employed teams of racemen to manage a section of each race and how the water was distributed. The races were mainly hand-dug by crews of men, and for many years after they were hand-cleaned when turned off in the winter. As excavators become available, mechanical cleaning substantially reduced the labour required for this, and also moved the races gradually into more secure ground by digging into the adjoining bank and then forming a bench to access on. The races are generally very flat. Grades of 1 and 1500 are quite common. And in return, they're wide and slow flowing. Some are effectively just a slow moving storage dam. Years of improving these race systems have made them far more secure than the early days, and breaches of them are now very rare. Many people were employed to manage these schemes, and while today one person generally has the responsibility for nearly all or an entire scheme, as a young boy I can remember our raceman being one of a larger team and doing his daily rounds. He liked to chat, which was fine if Dad wasn't busy, but would have us diving for cover if he was. They were also very good sources of local gossip, which was great to be kept up to speed, but then not if the gossip's about you. Today, on our farm, the scheme runs much more autonomously, and we have no idea what our neighbours are up to. Some of the schemes are supplying to properties of similar scale since really they were first built. However, most have had the properties within their command areas subdivided and are experiencing land use changes too. For example, the Herlihy scheme, supplying from Chatto Creek to Alexandra, originally only had about 30 properties, farms and orchards over about 2,400 hectares. For basically that same area today, it now has 350 properties. The Arrow scheme is in a similar situation. There are still a few farms and orchards, however, these are now well surrounded by lifestyle properties in these schemes. Most schemes in Central Otago are experiencing this demand to divide properties and vary the land use. The water is mostly delivered on rosters and race systems, and the return periods can be 2 to 3 weeks. 3 weeks or 21 days is a really long time when it's dry and if you're irrigating light soils. When the properties were larger, the irrigator could shuffle to best suit the lighter and heavier soils within their property. But then as they've been subdivided, the ability to do this diminishes, and there are now rosters so tight that some people receive their water at night on a 3-week rotation. While larger irrigators often can be negative towards lifestyle block owners, I have a respect for them, especially the ones that are up irrigating while I'm sleeping. Another point that's really relative to irrigation schemes in Central Otago, and I guess elsewhere throughout New Zealand, is that being an irrigator on a scheme means you're some way connected to a number of other people surrounding you by easements and races within the scheme. This has been the case since the scheme's inception, and irrigators then and now have got to work together for a successful operation. I guess it's the cooperative model. I've heard many stories from right back since the scheme started of the issues and disputes and fights and value of water between neighbours and others within their schemes. Some of them I thought were pretty far-fetched, until in my scheme chairman time, I found myself with a situation where I had to explain to a newly arrived property owner that it's not a good idea to threaten to kill him when an outlet gate wasn't reset correctly. Because one day you're likely to need to ask them for something. Maybe it's an easement, or maybe you're going to find yourself racing into a late meeting that's full with only one seat left, and guess who it's beside? It's also quite hard to irrigate from jail. The end of the 19th century and the decades following has evolved the Central Otago Valley floors into the productive and picturesque communities we have today, all made possible due to the foresight of those who fought for and achieved those irrigation developments all those years ago. As our generation strives towards the challenges we currently face with consent renewals and infrastructure upgrades, we need to remember the efforts of those before us that made all of this possible. Thank you.
Geez, I tell you what, I go to a lot of conferences and I haven't seen a more fascinating start to one in a very long time, so thank you very much for that presentation, Gary. And the third of our presentations, we've gone from the first wave, now on to the second wave of irrigation government schemes and building privatisation. Gavan Herlihy is a semi-retired farmer. They all are when they're from the Maniototo. They never really retire. So he has served as an MP for Otago from 1996 to 2002. He's currently chair of the Otago Rural Support Trust, and he's had various governance roles in irrigation. So ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Gavan Herlihy.
thanks to radar. There's an old saying in Central Otago, if you tamper with your neighbour's wife, you can get into a bit of trouble. But if you tamper with your neighbour's water, you are in real deep trouble. Such is the value of water in Central Otago. So why is water so important to those who live in this region? Pretty simple, really. Central Otago lies in the rain shadow created by the Southern Alps, where the spatial variability is extreme. A transect from the west to the east coast will encounter rainfall that ranges from 7,000 millimetres in the west to about 350 mils in Alexandra. As has been mentioned this morning, Central Otago is the drought capital of New Zealand. Both pastoral agriculture and the growing horticultural sector rely heavily on irrigation, with the future of many rural communities in Central Otago being dependent on their continued access to this region's water resources. My allotted role this morning is to complete the Central Otago story, irrigation in the last 20 years. The central story is markedly different from that of our northern neighbours, namely North Otago and Canterbury. Our irrigation seen in the past 20 years has not been dominated by the construction of large-scale irrigation schemes such as the Central Plains in Canterbury and the ambitious North Otago project. No Crown money for construction has actually found its way south. Instead, irrigation development has been driven by individual farmers. Yes, private, not community initiatives. Many millions of dollars have been invested in on-farm irrigation infrastructure by Central Otago farmers in the last 2 decades. Data gleaned from Blanquer Research and Aqualink show there are now just on 300 centre pivots in Central Otago, with the vast majority of these installed in the last 8 years, once the brakes imposed by the global financial crisis were released. Only a very small percentage of these pivots have dairy cows grazing under them. Down south, more irrigation doesn't necessarily equate to more dairy cows, contrary to current mantra. Further, the Central Otago irrigation scene is not solely the domain of the pastoral sector. Land along the banks of the Kelliher River that once ran a few malnourished merinos is now producing quality wines and fruit, with the crop of the moment being cherries. This has only been made possible by the use of the region's water, a fact that escapes the green Auckland latte set, who works eloquent about the virtues of our region's Pinot Noirs and Central Otago cherries, while in the same breath decry the use of water for irrigation. But in my few minutes this morning, I'm going to discuss with you the immediate challenge facing the wider Central Otago irrigation scheme, namely the impending demise of the mining rights system, a water allocation system that has been the cornerstone of the Central Otago irrigation story since pastoral settlement started in the late 19th century. The transition from mining rights is a challenge unique to Central Otago. I want to share that story with you this morning. Firstly, I will retrace the background as to why and how Central Government put a red line through mining rights. Secondly, I will outline how these actions of Central Government almost 30 years ago has resulted in a monumental hospital pass, not only to Central Otago irrigators and their communities, but also to the Otago Regional Council and those agencies that we commonly refer to down here as interested parties, namely Fish and Game Otago, the Department of Conservation, and the body representing Maori interests, TKTO Limited. Finally, if we are to achieve transition within the next 3 years as dictated by statute, I suggest some solutions to achieve acceptable outcomes for all the players involved. Come on, don't do this to me. That's better. Central Otago is drained by two river systems, the mighty Kelliher River and the smaller Tyree River. The mining rights, or deemed permits as they are more correctly now called, are dotted along every tributary, both large and small, that ultimately flow into these two rivers. I acknowledge the Otago Regional Council for the provision of this data. So what was the catalyst for change? There was general political consensus in the 1970s and 80s that the Soil and Water Conservation Act had run its course and that the various bits of legislation that shaped the use of the nation's resources needed consolidating. Thus, the evolution of the Resource Management Act that was finally passed into law in 1991. It was an anathema to the tidy-minded Wellington policymakers that there was a dual system of water allocation in existence, with the holders of mining rights being able to thumb their noses at bureaucracy. The rewrite of the law governing resource use, in particular water, afforded by the Resource Management Act in 1991 was the opportunity the policy boffins have been waiting for. Their plan was to legislate the mining rights out of existence, with holders of these rights then having to reapply under a permit system common to all other regions in New Zealand. But there was a problem. Mining rights were a property right. Farmers actually owned the water. Terminating mining rights raised the politically sensitive issue of compensation. Some counted that as all these so-called mining rights were issued for mining purposes, it was only timely that these rights were scrapped, as the days were long gone since this water was used for mining. Absolute rubbish. The vast majority of these rights, as we've already heard this morning, were never used for mining, but were issued for irrigation purposes by the various wardens' courts dotted around the Central Otago region. These mining rights were property rights akin to a freehold land right. They were bought and sold. This sale and purchase agreement relates to a mining right bought by my grandfather back in 1912. It's a marvellous old document full of here-tos and whereofs, the colourful legalese of the era. The purchase price for only 3 heads of water was £50. While this right only produces reliable water during the spring and early summer period, it is still a valuable part of our family's farming operation. Thus, to put a red line through these property rights when the resource management legislation was being designed in the late 1980s would have meant compensation being paid to mining right holders. So rather than front up to the responsibility, the politicians of the day put it in the too hard basket and extended the life of mining rights for a 30-year period, namely to 2021. They transferred the problem to future generations, yes, a classic hospital pass. The fact that Parliament of the day, some 30 years ago, put a red line through these water entitlements without compensation was but a confiscation of property rights that even Robert Mugabe may have been proud of. But that's history. We now have to move on. Statute now requires that those who own, use and depend on water under the mining rights system have but 3 years to seek a replacement permit. The Otago Regional Council advised that there are approximately 365 old mining permits still in existence that will expire in 2021. There is a frightening amount of work to be done in a very short time frame. Under the mining rights system, farmers had absolute rights to the water. The pendulum of interest was swung totally in their favour. Some environmental interests believe that the demise of the mining rights system now gives them the opportunity to swing the pendulum totally in their favour. Such an approach is doomed to fail, as farmers will have little alternative but to fight to protect their interests. I strongly contend that the way forward is for the diametrically opposed parties, farmers at one end of the spectrum and environmentalists at the other end, to negotiate an outcome that finds a balance between the environmental values of the water and the social and economic use of the water. So how are farmers handling this enforced transition from mining rights? The approach generally has been taken by farmers is to band together on a catchment basis. You'll hear more of this process later in the morning from the Gavan irrigators. I give warning that you will be totally blown away at the amount of time and money the small group of irrigators have had to spend to protect their interests so imperative to them. For them, it's been a very expensive hospital pass. This map, again prepared by the Otago Regional Council, shows the permits and catchments where the transition to replacement permits has been successfully progressed. But these pale in insignificance to the catchments that have still yet to make that transition. But as I hinted at in my introduction, farmers were not the only body affected by the decisions of our political forebears some 30 years ago. Statute directs that the Otago Regional Council has the role of awarding permits to replace the mining rights. It goes without saying that central government has not provided the Otago Regional Council with additional funding for this role. So how well placed is the ORC to determine the balance between the competing interests of the water source, that is between the environmental and the social and economic use of a catchment's water? The answer is provided by looking at the skill set of the staff employed in the Consents Division of the Otago Regional Council. The vast majority of these staff bring with them formal training in the environmental sciences, so the environmental aspects of an application triggered by the demise of a mining right are able to be given due scrutiny. But where are the staff with production economic background to bring scrutiny to the social and economic aspects of any such application? They are missing in action. Such additional staff would require additional funding, but I believe this imbalance must be corrected if the ORC is to provide the level playing field expected of a neutral consenting authority. To highlight my point, this report on the Pigburn Creek was compiled by the ORC staff last year. This report is an overview of the environmental values of the Pigburn and even suggests flows necessary to sustain them. But where is the equivalent report titled The Social and Economic Values of the Pastoral Use of Water from the Pigburn Creek? The ORC just do not have the staff with the skill sets to produce such a report that would provide the required balanced approach, nor the resources to contract outside providers to undertake such work. Further, the transition from mining rights has a major impact on the institutions that represent environmental interests in this water allocation process. Fish and Game, Otago, the Department of Conservation, and Kaitahu Ki Otago Limited are all drastically understaffed to enter into meaningful discussions with existing water users in the myriads of creeks and waterways that are still up for scrutiny in the next 3 years. Especially so if they choose to scrutinise each and every mining right or deem permit and to enter into negotiations with both individuals or catchment groups to arrive at alternative allocation systems that are acceptable to all parties within the 3-year period. The situation will only be compounded if negotiations break down and a permit application progresses to the Environment Court. Thus, my advice to Fish and Game, DOC and KDKO is to direct your scarce resources to those waterways that will result in real and sustainable environmental gains. But with an observation that unless the process attempts to arrive at a result that sees the pendulum somewhere in the middle, the resources of the interested parties will be quickly exhausted as replacement permit applications, that is, end up in the Environment Court. That's an outcome that's in nobody's interest, except for the consultancy business and the legal fraternity. So finally, with the sun setting on the mining right allocation system, Central Otago irrigators have a unique set of challenges to confront. I trust that has given you an in-depth understanding of the forces and processes that led to the hospital pass being thrown in our direction almost 30 years ago, one that has finally landed in our lap. But I am optimistic that we will rise to the challenge. But this will require an acceptance by farmers who traditionally have had an unfettered use of the available water resource, that there are other interests that have to be considered in the use of such water. At the other end of the spectrum, the interested parties must recognise the social and economic value to the local communities that currently inherent in the existing use and pitch their demands accordingly. They must concentrate their efforts where real, not illusionary, environmental outcomes will be achieved. To conclude, in the words immortalised by Sir Winston Churchill, if we open a quarrel between the past and the present, we shall find we have lost the way to the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Gavan. I know there's a few lawyers and consultants in the audience now thinking, all right. Ladies and gentlemen, what a wonderful start today. We don't really have time for any questions, but I suspect our speakers are going to be able to hang around for morning tea. Great, because I know that many of you may well have a question for them. So please join me in thanking Mr. Terry Davis, who we saw initially, Gary Kelliher and Mr. Gavan Herlihy. A round of applause for each and every one of them. And thank you as well to Edward, to Francie, Louise and Cindy for that welcome to this area. What a great way to start the morning and this conference. To be welcomed here and then, in essence, to have a sense of the whakapapa of these irrigation schemes that surround us. We are going to go to morning tea now. It is over in the gymnasium. It's brought to you by Goldfields, so thank you very much to Goldfields. As you know, there's a bit of a stroll between here and there, so timing is going to be crucial. We really want to get that next session started underway at exactly 10:30, so we'll be back in here at 10:30. And again, another round of applause for all of our speakers. Thank you very much.